So we thought today it would be useful to have a chat about a common scenario that we often come across, and that's where a client either already owns or he is looking to purchase a property, but it's a mixed-use property. So by that we mean the ground floor is a commercial unit and the upstairs could have residential accommodation. Obviously, from our perspective, alarm bells ring because the general rule is residential property can't be put into a pension scheme. But are there ways around it? Garry, what would your initial response be?
Well, mixed-use properties, we see a lot of them. It tends to be a very popular type of property that's brought to us. And as you rightly say, there is an element of alarm because of the residential element. So as we mentioned, pension providers ultimately are looking at properties to make sure that they're commercial and therefore permissible under HMRC guidance. But it's probably not fair to say that residential property is completely unpermitted. There are instances where you're allowed a residential property within a pension scheme. Very complex area, so I won't go into too much detail, but just briefly, the types of businesses that may be allowed to operate with a commercial and a residential element are things such as pubs, hotels, and those types of occupations whereby it's critical that there's a member of staff that lives on site. It's also worth mentioning that person can't be the pension member or any connected party to them, and they can't pay any level of rent to either the pension scheme or the business owners for staying in that accommodation. It also must be written into their employment contract as to why they're staying there, and obviously that they're not trading any rent. Failure to do that or breach any of those rules, or if the property becomes vacant, may mean that we've got an unpermissible property within the pension scheme that will result in extremely high tax charges up to even 80% of the scheme value. So it's really important that we engage with the pension provider, that we engage with solicitors to make sure that we're not breaching those rules. I guess moving forwards, Caroline, it'd be interesting to hear from your point of view, from a legal point of view. Obviously, we know that we can look at mixed-use properties. We know that we can buy commercial elements. How, from a legal point of view, do you structure any such arrangement to ensure that we're not crossing any lines there and moving residential property into a pension scheme?
Well, when we get a property like this to buy, the first thing we do is to identify the parts of the property that are going to be in commercial use, because those are the bits that can be bought by the pension scheme. So then we will want to separate the building up into separate sections and grant a lease of the commercial parts, and make sure that any residential or other types of use are excluded from that lease, and also any communal halls or staircases, any communal parts of the building are excluded from the commercial lease, to make sure that there's no HMRC charge on the pension scheme for having unpermitted property in it. So we create a lease. Halls and staircases which are in communal use can be a tricky part of the building. You have to be quite careful. They can be used, but you have to be very careful to make sure that you don't breach the rules on those areas. So the freehold itself can't go into the pension scheme. We just put a lease into the pension scheme, and the freehold would be bought by either the pension scheme member or his company or some third party who's got a connection with the pension scheme member in order to bring the whole building into the sort of orbit of the pension scheme member without actually putting any residential part into the pension scheme itself.
Okay, I mean, the question that I get asked from time to time when we're looking at mixed-use properties is, could we not just simply split the title and create two freeholds? I mean, I think I know the answer, but from a legal viewpoint, how would
Yes.
Why would you not look at that as an example?
The way that property law here has developed, freeholds are properties that are not separated horizontally from other properties. So that is other titles. A freehold goes up to the sky and down to the centre of the earth. So if you have a part of a building which is separated horizontally from another part, such as the commercial part from the residential, you can't make two separate freehold titles, and that's why we use a lease instead.
And another point that's useful to mention is also the value of that leasehold interest, because essentially by carving that leasehold interest out, then a value needs to be paid for that, and it's sort of calculating what that is, and that's something that's often a bit difficult to get your head around. So basically we can't just pluck a figure out of the air for that leasehold interest, and we need to actually work out the amount that's going to be paid back to the private investor, to the scheme member in the individual capacity by the pension scheme for that long leasehold. And the way that that's done is by appointing a valuer and getting them to assess what the market value for that interest actually is. And by doing so, then you've got a record that is the market value, and there's sort of not a risk there of breaching the pension regulations because you've complied with HMRC's rules on it. And then in summary, basically, what are we left with? So we're essentially at the end of structuring how we structure it from a legal point of view, we're left with one freehold interest, which is owned by the private investor, the scheme member, in their individual capacity. And then we're left with a long leasehold interest of the ground floor of the commercial parts, excluding obviously any communal parts. And so you'll have two registered title, one freehold title, one leasehold title in the name of the pension scheme. On that freehold title, you'll also have noted that long leasehold interest. So it'll be very clear to any future purchaser that it's subject to the pension scheme's long lease.
Property in general within any portfolio for a client offers a good level of diversification. You mentioned there, of course, about the market, the values for purchasing and purchasing the lease, connected party transaction. That tends to lend itself to also the types of people that are looking to purchase a property within a pension scheme. So more often than not, we're approached, certainly for physical bricks and mortar properties and pension schemes, we're approached by business owners looking to either buy a property off of themselves or buy one from the open market and then lease it back to themselves. So an owner-occupier type arrangement. The reasons why they may look to do that, there's several, but it's generally to do with things such as the rental income. So rental income from a commercial property is actually deemed investment growth and not a contribution. So it doesn't interfere with any members' annual contribution allowances. Also, if the business is the tenant of the property, that rent that they pay to the pension scheme is actually a business expense, and it can be offset against any potential corporation tax liability that the business might have. And also, it's a cash injection from the pension scheme back into the business. I wouldn't suggest any failing businesses look to do that because it's not a good way to spend your pension money. But if you're a growing business and you're asset rich and maybe don't have liquidity, releasing the money from your pension scheme back to your business can help you grow and prosper, whether that's expanding the business in terms of employing more people, or whether it's buying stock or so on. So you can help that business to grow and prosper.